The children found them while hunting squirrel in November of 1953. 42 depressions in the forest floor, arranged in 3 concentric circles beneath virgin hemlock that had never been logged. Each depression exactly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, spaced with geometric precision that made young Bobby Pritchett's grandmother cross herself when she saw the clearing. The soil there grew nothing but bloodroot and trillium, flowers that bloomed white then turned the color of rust. When archaeologists from the University of Kentucky excavated the site 6 months later, they found what the Pritchett boy had suspected. 42 skeletons, men, women, and children, buried without coffins or ceremony in a single night's work. Most showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. 3 had been buried alive. The bones dated to the 1850s, but every official record from Harlan County for that decade had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1879. A fire, witnesses said, burned hot enough to crack limestone, as if someone had wanted to make certain the dead stayed buried. The hollow had no official name on any map drawn before the Civil War, but everyone in eastern Kentucky knew it as Carver Hollow, after the family that had claimed the watershed in 1798 and ruled it like Highland chieftains ever since. 300 acres of bottomland nestled between ridges so steep a man could touch both slopes from the creek bed, accessible only by a single wagon trace that wound through a limestone gorge the Shawnee had called the throat that swallows. Sycamore and elm crowded the valley floor. Wild grapevine thick as a man's arm hung from the canopy. The creek itself ran clear over limestone shelves, cold enough to numb your hands even in August. By 1858, 47 souls lived in Carver Hollow. The Carver family itself numbered 19, spread across a main house and 3 cabins. The rest were what the Carvers called hollow folk, families who worked Carver land, used the Carver grist mill, bought goods on credit at the Carver store, and understood without being told that certain questions were better left unasked. Nathaniel Carver, patriarch at 63, had built the hollow's prosperity on timber, ginseng, and a particular quality of whiskey that sold well in Louisville despite its questionable legality. He was tall and lean, white-haired, but still strong enough to split his own kindling, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink. His wife Mary had died in 1846. His 3 sons, Ezekiel, Thomas, and Jacob, ran the family operations with military efficiency. Ezekiel handled timber contracts. Thomas managed the still. Jacob, youngest at 28, oversaw what the family called special trade. The hollow folk whispered about that special trade, whispered about wagons that arrived after dark, whispered about the root cellar beneath the main house that no one but Carvers ever entered, whispered about the children who had come to the hollow over the years, orphans supposedly, but who never quite seemed to belong to anyone, and who sometimes disappeared as mysteriously as they'd arrived. But whispers cost nothing, and the Carvers paid wages in silver coin when other landowners paid in scrip. They let families keep kitchen gardens. They didn't charge interest on store credit until you were 6 months late. In a place where choices were measured in degrees of hardship, the hollow offered a livable compromise. Sarah Mullins had lived in Carver Hollow since 1851, when her husband brought her there from Virginia. She was 24 now, mother of 2 girls, pregnant with a 3rd child. Her husband Daniel worked the timber crews. They lived in a 1-room cabin at the hollow's southern end, near where the trace began its climb toward the county road. From her doorway, Sarah could see most of the valley. She noticed things other people chose not to see, like the girl who appeared in March of 1858. 10 or 11 years old, dark-haired, wearing a dress too fine for hollow life. The Carvers said her name was Elizabeth, said she was a niece from Tennessee whose parents had died of fever. But Sarah saw how Elizabeth's eyes tracked every sound, how she flinched when anyone moved too quickly, how she never spoke unless Jacob Carver specifically told her to answer. Sarah mentioned it to Daniel one night, voice low even though their cabin was empty except for the sleeping girls. "Something's wrong with that child." Daniel set down the harness he was mending. "We don't know their business. I'm not asking you to know it. I'm saying something's wrong. Sarah." His voice carried a warning. "We've got 2 daughters and another baby coming. We've got food on the table and a roof that doesn't leak. Whatever the Carvers do, it's not our concern." She wanted to argue, but Daniel was right about the food and the roof and the baby coming. So Sarah said nothing more, and the days passed into weeks, and Elizabeth remained in the hollow like a question no one dared to answer. Jacob Carver kept a ledger in the locked desk of his bedroom, a leather-bound volume with marbled end papers and columns ruled in India ink. The entries dated back to 1843, written in Jacob's careful copperplate hand. Each page documented what Jacob called a placement, including date, source, price paid, and destination. The ledger recorded 73 placements over 15 years. The Carver family's special trade was children. Orphans purchased from institutions in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, some legitimate adoptions through proper channels, others acquired through arrangements that required discretion and cash. The children arrived in the hollow at night, stayed for periods ranging from weeks to months, then departed for their final destinations, farms and households across Kentucky and Tennessee where labor was scarce and questions were scarcer. The arrangement was profitable but not inherently cruel. Many of the children found decent homes, learned trades, avoided the worse fates that awaited orphans in eastern cities. Jacob told himself this regularly. His father had started the trade as a charitable venture, helping frontier families who needed extra hands, helping orphanages reduce their burden. That it also generated income was merely practical. But not all placements went to families. Some went to men who paid premium prices for specific qualities. Girls between 8 and 12, Jacob noted these in coded notations he'd learned from his father, marks that meant buyer requires discretion or special terms apply. He didn't ask what happened after these transactions. Didn't want to know. The money was excellent, and his father had taught him that survival in the mountains meant taking opportunities that softer men refused. Elizabeth was a special terms placement. She'd arrived from a Pittsburgh orphanage in February, purchased for $35, scheduled for delivery to a buyer near Nashville who'd paid $200 in advance. But the buyer's agent hadn't arrived as expected. A message came instead, delay of 2 months. Hold the merchandise. So Elizabeth remained in the hollow, sleeping in a corner of the main house kitchen, doing small chores, saying little, while Jacob waited for the transaction to complete. He treated her decently, he thought, fed her the same food the family ate, let her sleep by the warm stove, didn't allow his brothers to be rough with her. But he also watched her constantly, knowing that a $200 investment could disappear down the creek trace if he grew careless. The other hollow folk saw Elizabeth and assumed she was what the Carvers claimed, a niece, a family member. Most had learned not to scrutinize Carver explanations too closely, but a few noticed discrepancies. Sarah Mullins wasn't the only one who wondered. Thomas Garrett had lived in the hollow since birth, 34 years. His father had worked Carver timber until a falling oak killed him in 1849. Thomas had continued the work, married a hollow girl, built a cabin near the grist mill. He was a quiet man, religious in the undemonstrative way of mountain folk, someone who read his Bible nightly and tried to live by its plainest commandments. Thomas had seen 12 children come through the hollow over the years. He'd watched them arrive and depart, and told himself it was charity, the Carvers helping orphans find homes. But Elizabeth troubled him. The way she never smiled, the way she tried to make herself invisible. The bruises on her arms that Jacob claimed came from clumsiness, but that Thomas recognized as finger marks. In April, Thomas rode to the county seat, a full day's journey from the hollow. He spoke with Sheriff Coleman, a man he'd met twice before at church gatherings. He asked careful questions about orphans, placement, about whether such arrangements required legal documentation. Coleman was a practical man who understood mountain politics. The Carvers paid taxes promptly and maintained order in their hollow. What they did internally was their own business unless it created problems for the county. "You making an accusation, Thomas?" "No, sir. Just wondering about the law." "The law is, families can adopt orphans through proper channels. If someone's skirting those channels, that would be a concern. But I'd need evidence of wrongdoing, not suspicions." Thomas left the sheriff's office with nothing accomplished, except making his concerns official. He rode back to the hollow, knowing he'd likely made a mistake. The trouble started on a Tuesday evening in late April, during one of the informal gatherings that happened most weeks at the Carver store. A dozen hollow folk sat on the porch or on barrels inside, smoking pipes, discussing weather and crops and the persistent rumors of political crisis back east. The talk was idle, the company comfortable. These gatherings were one of the hollow's few communal traditions. Elizabeth sat in the corner where Jacob had told her to wait while he conducted business. She'd learned to be furniture, to disappear into walls and shadows. But something happened that night that broke her careful invisibility. Margaret Tully, a hollow woman of 40 who'd known hard years but maintained a streak of stubborn kindness, offered Elizabeth a piece of horehound candy from her apron pocket. "You look like you could use something sweet, child." Elizabeth glanced at Jacob. He was deep in conversation with Ezekiel about lumber contracts, not watching. She took the candy carefully, whispered thank you. Margaret smiled. "You settling in all right? Must be hard, losing your family." The question was innocent, but Elizabeth, 11 years old and worn down by months of fear and displacement, couldn't maintain the fiction. "I don't have family. I came from the home." The conversation around them didn't stop immediately, but it faltered. Several people heard. They looked at Elizabeth, at Jacob, at each other. Jacob's hand came down on Elizabeth's shoulder, not violent, but firm. "She's confused. Lost her parents to fever, poor thing. Sometimes she gets mixed up." But Elizabeth, perhaps sensing a moment where truth might matter, pressed forward. "I'm not mixed up. They bought me. $35. I heard them say it." Silence spread through the store like frost. Every face turned toward Jacob now. He forced a laugh. Children's imaginations. "Elizabeth, you need to go wait in the wagon." "I don't want to go with the man who's buying me." Her voice was small but clear. "Jacob said I have to be nice to him, or he'll send me somewhere worse." The adults in that room faced a choice. They could accept Jacob's explanation, dismiss a child's claims, maintain the comfortable fiction that let them sleep at night. Or they could acknowledge what they'd suspected, what they'd chosen not to see, what seeing would require them to confront. Thomas Garrett stood. "Jacob, what's she talking about?" "Nothing. A misunderstanding. Elizabeth, come here now." But Margaret Tully moved between Jacob and the girl, a woman positioning herself as shield. Let her speak. This is not your concern, Margaret. Is it true? Have you been trading children? The store was packed with witnesses now, 18 or 20 people, all watching Jacob Carver claim or deny something that would reshape every relationship in the Hollow. He chose denial, but it was a moment too slow, too calculated. These are family matters, private affairs. All of you need to mind your own business. Where do the children go, Jacob? Thomas kept his voice level. Where's little James, who was here last summer? Where's Ruth from 2 winters ago? Placed with good families, proper homes. We help orphans find situations. There's nothing wrong in that. For money? Margaret's voice hardened. You sell them for money? Jacob's jaw tightened. I'm telling you all, this is not your concern. Go home. This conversation is finished. But something had broken. The compact of willful ignorance that held the Hollow together had shattered, and questions that had lived underground for years were pushing toward daylight. Sarah Mullins spoke from the doorway. How many children, Jacob? How many have you sold? He looked at her, at the gathered Hollow folk, at the moment crystallizing around him. Then he turned and walked out, calling over his shoulder, Elizabeth, come now. The girl didn't move. Margaret Tully's hand rested on her shoulder, and for the first time in months, Elizabeth felt something like protection. Jacob stopped at the door. If she's not in the wagon in 1 minute, every family here will be out of the Hollow by Sunday. You'll have nothing. No work, no homes, no credit. You'll find out what real hardship is. The threat hung in the lamp-lit air. These were people who owned almost nothing, who lived season to season, who knew exactly how far it was to destitution. The Carvers controlled everything, the land, the work, the store credit that kept them fed through winter. What would you do standing in that room, weighing a child's safety against your own family's survival? Thomas Garrett spoke first. She stays here tonight, with Margaret. We'll sort this out tomorrow with your father. It was the moment the Hollow chose a side, and Jacob Carver walked into the dark alone, knowing that by morning, everything would have to change. Nathaniel Carver stood in his parlor at dawn, listening to Jacob explain how the previous night had unraveled. The old man's face revealed nothing, pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the window where the first light touched the ridge. When Jacob finished, Nathaniel was silent for 30 seconds. You threatened to evict them. I had to maintain control. You gave them a choice between principle and survival. Do. You know what frightened people do when you offer them that choice? They choose survival. Some do. Others decide they've got nothing left to lose. Nathaniel turned from the window. Get Ezekiel and Thomas. We need to decide how to handle this before church. Sunday services were held in the Hollow every other week, led by a circuit preacher named Brennan, who rode a loop through 6 mountain communities. This was his Sunday, which meant by 10 o'clock, every Hollow family would be gathered in the cleared area behind the Carver store where services were conducted. It would be the first time the community assembled since the confrontation. By 9:30, Nathaniel had made his decision. He called a meeting of the Hollow men, 23 of them in the store. The women and children waited outside in clusters, speculating in low voices. Nathaniel stood at the store's back wall, his sons flanking him. He was a man who understood power, how to project it, when to yield it, when to crush opposition before it could organize. He began with acknowledgement, the most effective kind of lie. I understand there were questions last night. Questions about our family's involvement with orphan placements. I want to address those questions directly. He explained the trade as charity, as Christian duty. Yes, they received fees, but those fees covered expenses and allowed them to help more children. Yes, some placements were with families who required discretion, but that was because of social prejudices, not anything sinister. Yes, the girl Elizabeth had been frightened and confused last night, but she was an orphan who'd suffered trauma, and her claims about being bought were a child's misunderstanding of adult arrangements. We've been doing this work for 15 years. We've placed over 70 children in good homes. Some of you in this room have seen these children arrive and leave. No one has been harmed. We've helped orphans escape city institutions where they would have faced far worse futures. It was a masterful performance, mixing truth and fabrication so seamlessly that separating them required more energy than most people possessed. Several men nodded along. Others looked uncertain, but not hostile. Then Thomas Garrett raised his hand. Can we see the records? The placements? The families? The money? Nathaniel's expression didn't change. Those are confidential arrangements. The families who take these children often require anonymity. I can't betray their trust. Then how do we know the children are safe? You have my word. And you have 15 years of this work being conducted without incident, until last night, when my son was publicly accused based on a frightened child's confusion. The room was dividing. You could see it in postures and glances, men calculating allegiances and risks. Jacob interjected, playing his role. I apologize for my reaction last night. I was defensive, but I want to be clear. Anyone who wants to leave the hollow can leave. No one is forced to stay. But if you choose to stay, you're choosing to trust this family that has fed and housed and employed you. You're choosing not to spread vicious rumors that could destroy our reputation, and by extension, your own livelihoods. Threats wrapped in reasonableness. The Carver method, refined over 3 generations. Preacher Brennan arrived while the meeting was still ongoing. He was a small man of 50, earnest and limited, who believed deeply in Scripture, but lacked the imagination to see how faith could be weaponized. Nathaniel pulled him aside, explained that there'd been a misunderstanding, that some hollow folk had misinterpreted the family's charity work. He asked Brennan to address the importance of trust and community in his sermon. Brennan, eager to be useful and completely unaware of the complexity beneath the request, agreed. The sermon that morning focused on Exodus, on the Israelites' constant doubts and rebellions despite Moses' leadership. Brennan's message was unsubtle. Communities prospered when they trusted their leaders. Dissent and accusation brought only suffering. Afterward, the hollow folk scattered without the usual socializing. Families walked home in tight groups, not speaking to neighbors. The fracture lines were visible now. Thomas Garrett and Margaret Tully on one side, several families maintaining neutrality, a few men, those most dependent on Carver employment, already drifting back toward the family's orbit. Elizabeth had spent the night with Margaret Tully and her husband Robert. That Sunday evening, Jacob came to their cabin. I'm taking Elizabeth back to the main house. Margaret blocked the doorway. She's staying here. She's Carver property. I don't mean that harshly, but legally, we have guardianship. You're interfering with family business. Robert Tully stood behind his wife, a tired man of 45 who'd survived by avoiding conflict, but he found himself speaking anyway. She's scared of you, Jacob. That ought to tell you something. She's a child who's been through trauma. She's scared of everything. I've cared for her for 2 months. Fed her, clothed her, kept her safe. Now you're suggesting I've done something wrong based on nothing but her confused statements. The standoff lasted 2 minutes. Finally, Margaret said, "She stays tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk with your father and the preacher and settle this properly." Jacob had the power to force the issue. He could have called his brothers, physically removed the girl. But that would shatter any remaining illusion of legitimacy. So he nodded, forced a smile, and walked away. That night, Robert asked his wife what she thought she was doing, risking everything for an orphan girl they barely knew. Margaret's answer was simple. What kind of people do we become if we don't? Monday morning brought rain, cold spring rain that turned the hollow's paths to mud and kept most people inside. Thomas Garrett rode to the county seat anyway, his horse slogging through the limestone gorge where water turned the trace into a creek bed. He reached Sheriff Coleman's office by noon, soaked through and determined. "I need to file a formal complaint." Coleman listened to Thomas's account of the store confrontation, of Elizabeth's claims, of Jacob's threats. He took notes in a ledger, his expression carefully neutral. "These are serious accusations, Thomas. Trading children. You understand what you're implying?" "I understand. I've been watching this happen for years and saying nothing. That stops now." "Do you have evidence? Anything beyond the girl's statements?" "Jacob keeps a ledger, detailed records. That's evidence." "That I'd need a warrant to examine. And to get a warrant, I need probable cause. One child's claims, disputed by the family, isn't enough, especially when the family has standing in the county." Thomas felt the familiar mountain arithmetic closing around him. So nothing happens. "I'm saying I need more than accusations. Bring me proof. Bring me witnesses who will testify. Bring me something solid, and I'll act. But I can't raid a prominent family's home based on suspicion." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, circling the same impasse. Coleman wasn't hostile or corrupt, just pragmatic. The county had limited resources. The Carvers paid taxes and caused no public disturbances. One child's confused statements didn't justify the crisis that a formal investigation would create. Thomas rode home through the rain, understanding that official channels would provide no help. The Hollow was on its own. While Thomas was gone, Jacob and Ezekiel visited 3 Hollow families, the Johnsons, the Pratts, and the Lewises. They brought small gifts, a ham, a sack of cornmeal, a yard of calico fabric. They were friendly, concerned, asking how everyone was managing, whether credit at the store needed extending, whether anyone needed help with spring planting. The message beneath the generosity was clear. The Carvers were keeping accounts. Loyalty would be rewarded. Opposition would be costly. By Wednesday, the Hollow had reorganized itself into 3 camps. Thomas Garrett, Margaret Tully, and Sarah Mullins formed the core of those demanding answers. 5 families had declared themselves neutral, neither supporting the Carvers nor joining the opposition. The remaining families, mostly those most economically dependent on the Carvers, had returned to treating Elizabeth's accusations as misunderstanding and the whole affair as unfortunate, but resolved. The Carver family watched and calculated. Nathaniel understood that their position was sustainable only if opposition remained fractured and leaderless. If the dissidents organized, if they brought in outside authorities, if they found concrete evidence, the situation could spiral beyond control. On Thursday evening, Nathaniel called another meeting of Hollow men at the store. Only 8 attended, the neutral and loyal factions. Thomas, Robert Tully, and 2 others refused the invitation, a refusal that itself conveyed opposition. I wanted to address a practical matter, Nathaniel began. The spring timber contract. We've been awarded cutting rights on 300 acres of state land near the Cumberland Gap. It's 4 months of solid work at premium wages. I'm selecting crews now. He let that sink in. Premium wages meant the difference between bare subsistence and something approaching security. The timber work would provide cash income that Hollow families could save, used to buy necessities the Carver store didn't stock, perhaps even build small reserves against future hardship. I'll be taking 15 men. Preference goes to those who've shown loyalty to this family and this Hollow. Those who've stirred up trouble, spread accusations. Well, I can't in good conscience take men I don't fully trust. It was the most direct threat yet, dressed in reasonable business language. The Hollow's dissidents would be economically isolated, cut off from the best employment opportunities, left to scrape by while loyal families prospered. That night, Margaret Tully and Sarah Mullins met at Margaret's cabin. Elizabeth was asleep in the corner. "They're going to starve us out," Margaret said quietly. "Robert won't say it, but I see him calculating. We've got 3 children. Without the timber work, we can't make store payments. By fall, we'll be debt bonded to them or forced to leave." Sarah touched her swollen belly, 8 months pregnant. "Daniel already told me he's applying for the crew. Says he can't sacrifice our children for someone else's. But if we all back down, if we let this go, what does that make us?" The women sat in silence, understanding they'd reached the question that had no good answer. Their principles demanded action. Their children's survival demanded submission. And time was running out to find a third option. Elizabeth had nightmares every night, dreams of dark rooms and men's voices and being unable to move or scream. She woke gasping, and Margaret would hold her until the shaking stopped. After a week of this, Margaret asked gentle questions, trying to understand what the girl had actually experienced. The story that emerged was worse than Margaret had feared. Elizabeth had been at the Pittsburgh orphanage for 2 years after her mother died. The orphanage was overcrowded, understaffed, a place where children learned hardness quickly. When the Carver agent came offering placement with a Kentucky family, the orphanage director had been eager to reduce her population. Papers were signed. Money changed hands. No one asked Elizabeth what she wanted. The journey south had taken 6 days. The agent, a man named Dorset, traveled with 3 other children, younger than Elizabeth, all destined for different placements. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. Just a man doing a job delivering merchandise. At the Hollow, Jacob Carver had been initially decent, treating her like an unwanted but tolerable guest. Then the message came about the buyer's delay. Jacob's frustration showed itself in small cruelties, verbal jabs, occasional rough handling. Nothing that left permanent marks, but everything designed to remind Elizabeth that she was property with no rights or recourse. She'd overheard conversations in the main house, Jacob discussing her buyer with his father. The buyer wanted a specific type of girl, well-behaved, not rebellious, young enough to train. The conversation's implications made Elizabeth sick. She understood enough to know her future held something terrible. "Have you seen the root cellar?" Elizabeth asked Margaret one afternoon. "The locked one under the main house?" "I've heard of it, never been inside. I went down once. Jacob sent me to fetch something. He watched from the top of the stairs, but I looked around. There were chains on the wall. Shackles, but small, like for children's wrists." Margaret felt cold dread settle into her stomach. "You're certain?" "I know what chains look like. And there were marks on the floor. like someone had scratched tallies into the stone. Days, maybe, or people. I don't know. That night, Margaret told her husband what Elizabeth had described. Robert's face went gray. We should leave. Pack tonight, be gone by morning. And go where? We have no money, no prospects. And what about Elizabeth? She's not our responsibility, Margaret. Then whose is she? It was the question that divided the Hollow. Personal responsibility versus collective survival. Individual conscience versus community cohesion. Everyone had drawn their line somewhere. Few were satisfied with where that line had fallen. Thomas Garrett had been thinking about the root cellar since Margaret told him Elizabeth's description. On Saturday night, he made a decision that crossed from opposition into action. He would break into the cellar and see what the Carvers were hiding. He chose the darkest hours, well past midnight. He brought tools, a lantern, and his brother-in-law, Peter, a young man of 22 who'd agreed to help despite the risk. They moved through the hollow silently, keeping to shadows. The main house sat quiet, no lights showing. The root cellar entrance was at the building's rear, a storm door set at an angle into the earth. A heavy padlock secured it. Thomas had brought a pry bar. They worked for 15 minutes, trying to force the lock without making noise that would wake the household. The lock held. Then Peter whispered, "Someone's coming." They ran, leaving the pry bar behind in their haste, making it across the creek and into the tree line before light showed in the main house. They watched from cover as Ezekiel Carver emerged with a rifle, examined the damaged lock, and scanned the darkness. Thomas and Peter didn't return home until dawn, taking a long route around the hollow. Thomas found the pry bar on his doorstep when he arrived, left there as a message. "We know what you tried. We're watching." Brennan, the circuit preacher, returned to the hollow 2 weeks after his previous visit, riding in on a Thursday afternoon for a special service he'd agreed to conduct at Nathaniel Carver's request. The old man had sent a message asking Brennan to perform a blessing of the hollow, a reaffirmation of community bonds, with the subtle suggestion that a generous donation to the preacher's mission would accompany the service. Brennan was not a sophisticated man, but even he sensed the hollow's tension. People who should have greeted him warmly were distant, distracted. The Carvers themselves seemed coiled tight, watchful. That evening, Thomas Garrett sought out Brennan at the store where the preacher was lodging. Thomas carried a Baptist Bible, well worn, marked with marginalia and underlined verses. He showed Brennan specific passages about justice, about protecting the vulnerable, about the responsibility of the righteous to confront wickedness. "I need you to understand what's happening here before you bless anything tomorrow." Thomas explained the child trade, Elizabeth's accusations, the economic threats, the locked root cellar. He spoke plainly, without melodrama, letting facts carry their own weight. Brennan listened, his round face troubled. When Thomas finished, the preacher was quiet for a long moment. Then, "These are serious accusations, Thomas. But you're asking me to choose sides in a dispute I don't fully understand. The Carvers say the girl is confused, that they've been doing charitable work. You say they're trafficking children. I'm not qualified to judge who's telling the truth. Then stay neutral. Don't bless the hollow tomorrow. Don't lend religious authority to whatever the Carvers are doing here. I've already agreed to the service. Breaking that commitment would insult the family. And honestly, Thomas, I serve 6 communities. I depend on the goodwill and donations of families like the Carvers. If I take sides in every local dispute, I'll lose the ability to minister to anyone." There it was, the arithmetic of complicity. Brennan wasn't evil or even particularly cowardly. He was a man with limited power trying to maintain his position and effectiveness. Taking a principled stand would cost him his circuit, his livelihood, his ability to preach. So he chose the path that let him continue his work, telling himself that doing some good was better than doing no good at all. Thomas left the meeting understanding that the Hollow would receive no help from the church. They were isolated, economically threatened, without official support or religious backing. The blessing service the next day drew most of the Hollow. Brennan spoke about forgiveness, about letting go of grudges, about trusting in God's plan even when human understanding failed. The Carvers sat in the front, heads bowed piously. Nathaniel donated $20 to the preacher's mission, an astonishing sum that Brennan accepted with visible gratitude and quiet shame. After the service, Nathaniel announced the timber crew selections. 15 names, all from loyal or neutral families. Thomas Garrett's name was not on the list, nor Robert Tully's, nor any of the men who'd sided with them. The message was clear. Opposition had been identified and punished. Those who wanted to eat would need to reconsider their positions. By late May, the dissidents' position had become unsustainable. 3 families had already left the Hollow, packing what they could carry and departing in the night, leaving behind cabins and gardens and any hope of recovering store debts. The exodus was a slow bleed that Nathaniel Carver watched with satisfaction. Every departure strengthened his position and demoralized those who remained in opposition. Margaret and Robert Tully were down to their last sack of cornmeal. Their garden was just starting to produce, but it was weeks yet before they'd have real food from it. They owed the Carver store $18, a debt that grew more crushing with each passing day. Sarah Mullins gave birth to a daughter on May 23rd. The birth was difficult, and Sarah was weak afterward, unable to do her usual work. Daniel took the timber crew position he'd been offered, leaving Sarah alone with 3 children and a guilty conscience that manifested as a coldness between them that hadn't existed before. Thomas Garrett was cutting independent timber, small jobs for farmers outside the Hollow, work that paid in produce and occasional pennies. It wasn't enough to live on, but it kept his family fed while he tried to figure out a strategy that didn't end in starvation or submission. On June 1st, Nathaniel Carver called a Hollow-wide meeting at the store. Everyone came, the air thick with summer heat and fear. "I'm tired of division," Nathaniel began. "This Hollow has been my family's home for 60 years. We've built something here. A community where people care for each other, where families thrive, where even those with nothing can find a place. I'm proud of that." He paused, letting the words settle. "But some among you have chosen discord over unity. They've spread vicious lies about my family. They've tried to turn neighbors against each other. They've refused reasonable explanations and insisted on seeing evil where there is only charity." Thomas felt every eye in the room shift toward him and the handful of others who'd maintained opposition. "So here's what I'm offering. A choice. Those who've opposed us can apologize publicly, acknowledge they were wrong, and rejoin this community in good standing. I'll forgive your store debts. I'll offer you work. We'll move forward as if this ugliness never happened." He let that promise hang, golden and tempting. Then came the cost. "But if you choose to maintain your false accusations, if you insist on being enemies of this family and this Hollow, then you need to leave. I'll give you 1 week to gather your things and go. After that, I'll have the sheriff remove you as trespassers on Carver land." It was the final move, the closing of the vice. Submit or leave. There was no third option anymore. Margaret Tully stood, Her voice was shaking but clear. And what about Elizabeth? What about the truth of what you've been doing? Elizabeth is a confused child who's been encouraged in her confusion by adults who should know better. As for the truth, I've explained it multiple times. You've chosen not to believe me. That's your decision. But it's also your problem. Where's your ledger, Nathaniel? Show us the placements. Prove you've done nothing wrong. I don't need to prove anything to you, Margaret. This is my land, my hollow, my family's business. You're the one who needs to decide whether you're staying or going. The meeting broke up in tense silence. The dissidents, now down to 3 families, gathered at Thomas's cabin afterward. They looked at each other, exhausted and out of options. Robert Tully spoke what they were all thinking. We can't win this. They control everything. We have nothing. Thomas's wife, Martha, a woman who'd been silent through most of the crisis, said quietly, "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting and start surviving." It was surrender, spoken aloud, and no one had the strength left to argue. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. The survivors who spoke to investigators later, and there were only 6 survivors, told different stories, shaped by their own traumas and motivations. But certain facts were undisputed. On the night of June 7th, 1858, Thomas Garrett did not submit to Nathaniel Carver's ultimatum. Instead, he made one final attempt to expose the child trade and force outside intervention. He rode to the county seat in daylight, openly, and went directly to the courthouse. He filed a formal complaint alleging child trafficking, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. He named Nathaniel, Jacob, Ezekiel, and Thomas Carver. He demanded a warrant to search the Carver home and seize the placement ledger. Sheriff Coleman read the complaint with increasing discomfort. "Thomas, I warned you about this. You're making formal accusations without evidence. Then come get evidence. Search the house. You'll find the ledger. I need a judge to issue a warrant. Judge Harrison isn't due back in the county for 10 days. Even if I rush this, you're talking about a process that takes weeks. We don't have weeks. The Carvers are forcing us out. Once we're gone, whatever's in that cellar gets hidden or destroyed." Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas. "What if you're wrong? What if there's nothing there but legitimate business records? I'll have created a crisis with a prominent family over nothing." "I'm not wrong. But you've got no proof. Just a scared girl's claims and your own suspicions." The conversation went in circles for another hour. Coleman agreed to ride to the hollow himself, informally, to ask Nathaniel some questions. It was far less than Thomas wanted, but it was something. They rode together, arriving at Carver Hollow just before sunset. The hollow was quiet. Families in their cabins for supper. Coleman and Thomas went directly to the main house. Nathaniel received them courteously, offering coffee, asking about the sheriff's ride. When Coleman explained the purpose of the visit, Nathaniel's expression remained pleasant. "Of course, I'm happy to answer questions. Thomas has been struggling with some confusion, and I'm glad we can clear this up officially. He's alleging you've been trading children, buying them from orphanages and selling them to inappropriate buyers. I've been helping place orphans with families, yes, through proper channels. I work with licensed agents in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. The children come with documentation. They go to families who've been vetted. It's all legitimate. Can I see your records? I'd prefer not to open private business files without a warrant, but given the seriousness of these accusations, I'll make an exception." Nathaniel went to his study, returned with a ledger, though not the one Jacob kept in his locked desk. This was a sanitized version, showing placements with sanitized details. The money amounts were listed as administrative fees. The buyers were identified by name and location, all sounding legitimate. Coleman flipped through pages, finding exactly what Nathaniel wanted him to find: proper business records of a charitable enterprise. And the girl, Elizabeth? Thomas says she claims you bought her. Elizabeth is a traumatized orphan who's confused about how adoption arrangements work. She heard us discuss fees and thought that meant we purchased her. It's an understandable misunderstanding for a child. But she's being cared for, she's safe, and she'll be placed with a good family soon. Can I speak with her? She's not here. She's staying with the Tully family. They insisted on taking her after the initial confusion. I allowed it to reduce tensions. Coleman looked at Thomas. Is that true? Yes, but... So the girl you're saying is imprisoned and at risk is actually staying with a Hollow family of her own accord. The logic was airtight, the presentation flawless. Nathaniel had anticipated every accusation and prepared answers that transformed criminal enterprise into charitable work. Coleman closed the ledger. Mr. Carver, I apologize for the intrusion. It seems Thomas's concerns, while well-intentioned, are based on misunderstandings. Thomas tried to object, tried to explain about the second ledger, the root cellar, the coded notations. But Coleman had made his decision. He was not going to raid a respectable family's home based on one man's suspicions. They left together, Coleman satisfied that he'd done due diligence, Thomas vibrating with frustrated rage. At the hollow's edge, where the trace met the wagon road, Coleman said, I understand you're concerned, but you need to accept that sometimes the truth is less dramatic than we imagine. The Carvers are running a legitimate operation. Your accusations are endangering your own family for no reason. You're making a mistake, then prove it. Bring me actual evidence. Until then, this matter is closed. Coleman rode away, leaving Thomas standing on the road, understanding that the Hollow was now completely on its own. Whatever happened next would happen without outside help or intervention. Thomas returned to find the Hollow transformed. Word of the sheriff's visit had spread instantly, and the Carvers had positioned it as vindication. Nathaniel called another meeting that night, this one a celebration. He announced that all was well, the authorities had investigated and found nothing amiss, and the Hollow could return to normal. I want to welcome back those who've been misled. No hard feelings, no grudges. We move forward together. It was a masterful performance, generous and gracious, extending forgiveness to people who'd done him no wrong. The Hollow folk, exhausted and frightened, accepted the offered peace. Most of the dissident families began the process of submission. Margaret Tully went to Nathaniel the next morning and apologized, her voice flat with defeat. He forgave her publicly and wrote off her store debt with a flourish that made her feel like a hostage thanking her captor. But that night, something happened that changed everything. Peter, Thomas's brother-in-law, the young man who'd helped with the attempted cellar break-in, made a decision born of desperation or courage, or both. He waited until well past midnight, then returned to the main house alone. This time, he didn't try to pick the lock. He used an axe he'd brought, smashing the padlock in 4 heavy blows that echoed through the Hollow like thunder. He had perhaps 2 minutes before the Carvers would respond. He lit a match, held it high, and descended into the root cellar. What he found validated every suspicion. The walls were stone, the air cold and damp. Along the north wall, Shackles hung at heights appropriate for children's wrists and ankles. The floor bore scratches, hundreds of them, tallies carved by fingernails or small knives. A corner held a pile of children's clothes, dirty and torn. And on a makeshift shelf, Peter found a second ledger, the real one, with entries in Jacob's careful hand that recorded 73 placements with brutal honesty. Buyer: Stevens, discretion required. Price: $180. Buyer: Morrison, special terms. Price: $250. Peter grabbed the ledger and ran, emerging from the cellar just as lantern light showed in the main house. He fled toward the creek, splashing through the shallows, hearing shouts behind him. He made it to Thomas's cabin and burst through the door, gasping, holding the ledger like a sacred text. "I got it! I got proof!" Thomas lit a lamp, and the two men spent the next 30 minutes reading entries that documented 15 years of systematic child trafficking. Some children had gone to legitimate families, but dozens had gone to buyers whose notations, once you understood the code, revealed exactly what kind of men they were. "We take this to Coleman, show him the real ledger, he'll have to act." But even as Thomas said it, they heard movement outside. Torches flickered through the trees, voices calling in the darkness. The Carvers were coming with a search party, and they were coming armed. What happened in the next hour fragmented into different narratives depending on who survived to tell it. But the essential sequence was this. Nathaniel Carver roused not just his sons, but a dozen loyal Hollow men. Those who'd thrown their lot entirely with the family. He told them that Peter had broken into the cellar and stolen valuable documents, that he was a thief and a vandal, that he needed to be apprehended immediately before he could do more damage. The search party moved through the hollow with torches and rifles, converging on Thomas Garrett's cabin. Thomas met them at the door, the ledger hidden inside. "Peter's not here. He's a thief and a trespasser. We want him, and we want what he stole." Ezekiel Carver held a rifle casually, pointing at nothing specific but ready. "That ledger's evidence of your crimes. We're taking it to the sheriff." "That ledger is private property. You've stolen it. That makes you criminals." By now, other Hollow families had emerged from their cabins, drawn by the commotion. They stood in clusters, watching the confrontation, trying to decide which side they were on, or whether neutrality was still possible. Thomas made a decision. He pulled the ledger from inside his cabin and held it up where everyone could see. This documents 73 children, where they came from, what they were sold for, who bought them. Half of these buyers paid premium prices for girls under 12. You know what that means. Everyone here knows what that means. Nathaniel's voice was steel. "Give me the ledger, Thomas." "No. I'm writing to the county seat at first light. I'm showing this to Coleman, to Judge Harrison, to anyone who will look. You can't stop me. I can stop you right here. I can shoot you as a thief and a trespasser, and the law will thank me for it." The Hollow held its breath. 24 people watched to see if the standoff would erupt into killing. Margaret Tully stepped forward, Elizabeth by her side. "Let him go, Nathaniel. Let him take it to the authorities. If you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to fear." "You're choosing sides, Margaret? After I forgave your debt?" "I'm choosing children. I'm choosing what's right." Other voices joined hers. Sarah Mullins, despite her husband's presence in the search party. 2 other women, emboldened by Margaret's stand. Then, surprisingly, Robert Tully, stepping beside his wife even though it cost him everything. The Hollow was dividing in real time, families making final choices under torchlight. Nathaniel looked at his sons. A silent conversation passed between them. Then he lowered his rifle. Take the ledger, Thomas. Ride to the county. Show it to Coleman. But know this. Everything you're doing tonight destroys this hollow. The community we built. The security these families have. You're tearing it apart for your principles. When those families are starving come winter, remember that you chose this. Thomas mounted his horse, the ledger secured in his saddlebag. I'm not destroying the hollow. You did that when you started selling children. He rode away into the darkness, heading for the gorge, the county road beyond. Behind him, the hollow erupted into argument and recrimination, families splitting apart, old alliances dissolving. And in the chaos, no one noticed Jacob and Ezekiel Carver saddling horses and disappearing into the night, following Thomas's path toward the gorge. Thomas never made it out of the gorge. Jacob and Ezekiel caught him at the throat, the narrowest point where the limestone walls squeezed the trace to single-file width. They blocked his path with their horses, rifles raised. Give us the ledger, Thomas. I'm taking it to the sheriff. You're not going anywhere. Thomas tried to wheel his horse around, retreat back toward the hollow. But the gorge gave him no room to maneuver. His horse stumbled on loose stone, and Thomas fell, hitting the ground hard. He tried to rise, but Jacob was on him, fists and rifle stock, a beating administered with methodical efficiency. They took the ledger from his saddlebag, checked to make sure it was the right one, then dragged Thomas to the gorge wall. What they planned was execution. Leave him in the gorge where his body would be found days later, attributed to a riding accident. But Thomas was stronger than they'd anticipated. He fought back, catching Jacob off guard, landing a blow that broke the younger man's nose. In the struggle, Ezekiel's rifle discharged, the shot echoing off stone walls like a cannon blast. Thomas ran. Wounded, bleeding from the rifle blast that had caught his shoulder, but driven by pure survival instinct. He made it 200 yards before collapsing in the creek, the water turning red around him. The Carver brothers caught up, stood over him. Jacob still held the ledger. Should have minded your own business, Thomas. They left him there, assuming he'd bleed out before morning. They rode back to the hollow, arriving at dawn, and found it in chaos. The gunshot in the gorge had been heard by the entire valley. It broke whatever fragile peace the earlier confrontation had established. Families were packing. Arguments erupted into shoving matches. Someone had released the Carver's horses from the corral. The store had been broken into, supplies taken by families who figured they were owed. Nathaniel surveyed the destruction and made a final calculation. The hollow was finished. Too many people knew too much. Even if Thomas died in the gorge, others would talk, would go to authorities, would destroy the Carver family's reputation and business. The child trade was over. The question now was how to eliminate witnesses and preserve what freedom they could. He gathered his sons, spoke in low, urgent tones. The plan he outlined was brutal and desperate, born of a man who'd built a kingdom and watched it collapse in a single night. They would burn the hollow. Not just buildings, everything. They would eliminate everyone who could testify against them. They would make it look like an accident, a tragic fire that swept through the valley, consuming structures and people alike. Then they would disappear, take what money and valuables they could carry, and vanish into the Western territories where questions weren't asked and past lives didn't matter. Jacob and Ezekiel hesitated, but Nathaniel's will was absolute. It's this or the noose. Those are the only choices left. They began preparations at mid-morning, moving through the hollow as if conducting normal business. but actually positioning barrels of lamp oil, stacks of kindling, timing their work for that night when families would be asleep. But Margaret Tully saw. She'd been watching the Carvers all morning, seen their purposeful movements, noticed how they were positioning combustibles near cabins. She didn't understand the full scope of the plan, but she understood enough to know something terrible was coming. She gathered her children and ran. Not toward the gorge where Thomas had gone, but up the ridge, into the dense forest, where no horses could follow. Robert was with the search party for Thomas, and Margaret couldn't wait for his return. She took Elizabeth and her own 3 children and climbed, driven by instinct that saving her family meant leaving everyone else behind. Behind her, the hollow prepared for nightfall, the last normal hours before everything changed. The fire started at 11:37 on the night of June 8, 1858. Witnesses from neighboring valleys saw the glow in the sky and thought at first that it was a forest fire, common enough in dry summer conditions. But this fire burned with unnatural intensity, multiple points of origin, flames leaping from building to building with a speed that suggested accelerant and planning. Nathaniel Carver and his sons moved through the hollow like reapers. They set the store first, the structure's dry timber exploding into flame. Then the cabins on the hollow's eastern side, where the families most loyal to them had lived. The Carvers didn't differentiate between allies and enemies in those final hours. Everyone had become a liability. The first screams came from the Johnson cabin, a family of 5 including 3 children under 10. They woke to find their home engulfed, the door blocked from outside. 2 of them made it through a window. The others burned. The Pratt family tried to run toward the creek. Ezekiel Carver met them on the path with a rifle. He shot Joshua Pratt in the chest, reloaded, shot Sarah Pratt as she tried to drag her husband to safety. Their 2 sons fled into the darkness, and Ezekiel let them go, couldn't bring himself to shoot children in cold blood, though his father had given explicit orders to leave no witnesses. The hollow descended into hell. Families stumbling from burning cabins, smoke so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. The Carvers moving through the chaos with deadly purpose, eliminating anyone they recognized as a threat. Sarah Mullins had her newborn daughter in her arms when the fire reached her cabin. She ran toward the creek, hoping water would provide safety. She made it halfway before smoke inhalation took her strength. She collapsed in the shallows, holding her infant above the waterline with her last conscious effort. Daniel found them at dawn. The baby survived. Sarah did not. Robert Tully had been searching for Thomas in the gorge when the fires started. He saw the glow, heard the distant screaming, and rode back at a gallop. He found his cabin burning, no sign of his family. Panic drove him through the inferno, calling for Margaret, for his children, dodging flames and falling timbers. A Carver brother, he never knew which one, shot at him from darkness. The bullet grazed his skull, enough to knock him unconscious, but not kill him. He woke hours later in the creek bed, covered in ash, half his face burned. The hollow was silent except for the crack of burning wood and the occasional collapse of a structure. He searched through the devastation, finding bodies, calling names that received no answers. He never found his family. Margaret and the children had fled up the ridge, were miles away by the time the fire started. But Robert didn't know that. He searched until dawn turned to full morning, grief transforming into something colder and more focused. The Carvers were gone. The main house had burned last, deliberately torched after they'd loaded 3 wagons with everything valuable that could be carried. They'd left heading west, following old Indian trails into territory where civilization's reach was uncertain and memories were short. By sunrise on June 9th, Carver Hollow was gone. The settlement that had existed for 60 years, that had housed nearly 50 people, that had been a functioning community with all its complexities and compromises, had been reduced to smoking ruins and scattered bodies. 31 people died that night. 18 adults, 13 children. Their names were eventually recorded by investigators, though some identifications remained uncertain. The official cause was listed as accidental fire spreading through a densely built settlement. But enough survivors spoke of gunshots, of blocked doors, of seeing the Carvers moving with purpose through the flames, that darker truth lived in whispers and depositions that went nowhere. Thomas Garrett survived the night in the gorge. He'd crawled upstream until he found a hollow log large enough to hide in, where he'd passed out from blood loss and shock. A farmer from the next valley over, drawn by the fire's glow, found him at mid-morning, delirious and near death. The farmer's wife treated the gunshot wound with honey and whiskey, bound it with cloth strips, fed Thomas bone broth until his strength returned enough to speak. When he could talk, he told them everything. The child trade, the confrontation, the stolen ledger, the ambush, the brothers who'd left him to die. "Where's the ledger now?" the farmer asked. Thomas didn't know. The Carvers had taken it from him in the gorge. Whether they'd carried it away or destroyed it, he couldn't say. Without the ledger, without physical evidence, Thomas's testimony was just another man's claims. But the burned hollow and the body count added weight to his story. Sheriff Coleman rode out 3 days after the fire, brought deputies, began a formal investigation. They found mass graves where survivors had buried the dead. They found evidence of accelerants, of blocked doors, of execution-style shootings. They found enough to warrant murder charges if they could find the Carvers. A warrant went out. Descriptions circulated through Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia. Federal marshals were notified, since the child trafficking crossed state lines. But the Carvers had vanished into the Western Territories, into places where asking too many questions about a man's past was considered poor manners. Reports surfaced over the years. A man matching Nathaniel's description operating a trading post in Kansas. 3 brothers running a freight business in Missouri. A family named Carter, suspiciously similar, homesteading in Oregon. But none of the reports led to arrests. The Carvers, if they still lived, had successfully disappeared. The hollow itself was never rebuilt. The land reverted to the county for unpaid taxes in 1862. No one wanted property associated with such horror. The ruins gradually disappeared under vegetation and erosion, until only those who knew exactly where to look could find foundation stones and collapsed chimneys. The survivors scattered. Robert Tully eventually found Margaret and his children, learned they'd survived by fleeing early. But their marriage was broken by what they'd witnessed. They separated in 1863. Robert went west, some said to hunt for the Carvers, though if he ever found them, no record exists. Margaret remarried in 1867, never spoke of the hollow again, died in 1903 taking her detailed memories with her. Elizabeth vanished from official records after 1858. Some accounts say Margaret took her when she fled. Others say the girl was among the dead, her body never properly identified. There's a third version, less documented but persistent in family stories, that Elizabeth survived, was adopted by the farmer who'd helped Thomas, and grew up under a different name in a different county, carrying the hollow's nightmare silently through a long life. Thomas Garrett testified at a hearing in 1859, gave a formal deposition about the child trade and the massacre. The testimony went into county records, was noted by federal authorities, resulted in exactly nothing. No charges filed, no arrests made, no justice delivered. He moved to Louisville in 1861, worked as a carpenter, married, had children. He never returned to Harlan County, but he wrote letters, dozens of them over the years, to newspapers, to federal marshals, to anyone who might care about what had happened in that hollow. Most letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were polite but clear. Without physical evidence, without the ledger, without the Carvers in custody, there was nothing to prosecute. He died in 1894. His obituary made no mention of Carver Hollow. The children, the 73 documented in Jacob's ledger, dispersed across the country. Some were recovered by authorities and returned to orphanages. Others had been placed with legitimate families and lived normal lives, never knowing they'd been part of a trafficking network. A few ended up in situations exactly as terrible as Elizabeth had feared, their fates discovered only when later investigations into child exploitation networks found reference to Carver placements in the 1850s. The ledger itself never surfaced. Whether the Carvers destroyed it or hid it, whether it moldered in some forgotten cellar or burned in the hollow's fires, it was gone. The only record of the 73 children came from Thomas's testimony and from Elizabeth's fragmentary memories. Not enough for prosecution, barely enough for history. In the 1950s, when Bobby Pritchett found those 42 graves in the Hemlock Grove, the University of Kentucky's investigation reopened questions that had been buried for nearly a century. Forensic analysis confirmed the mass killing. Surviving documents from Harlan County, those that had escaped the 1879 courthouse fire, corroborated fragments of the story. But the fuller picture remained elusive, lost to time and deliberate concealment. No one was ever charged with the Carver Hollow massacre. The perpetrators had vanished too thoroughly, the evidence had degraded too completely, and frankly, in 1954 Kentucky, there was limited appetite for prosecuting a 100-year-old crime, even one as horrific as this. The Hollow's ruins became, briefly, an archaeological site. Then they returned to forest. Today, if you know the precise coordinates, you can still find the foundation stones. The depressions where the graves had been, filled in after the excavation, remain visible as slight irregularities in the forest floor. Locals avoid the area. Hikers who stumble across it report feeling uneasy, though whether that's psychological suggestion or something more, who can say? What's certain is that 47 people lived in a place called Carver Hollow in the spring of 1858, and by that summer, most were dead, and the rest scattered to places where they could pretend the hollow had never existed. The children, both those traded and those who died in the fire, left almost no trace. No photographs, no letters, no memorials. Just their bones in the woods. And somewhere in county archives, Thomas Garrett's unheeded testimony about the night a community chose survival over conscience, and paid the ultimate price for that choice. In Harlan County, old-timers still know the stories, passed down through generations of whispered warnings. They'll tell you, if you ask carefully, about the hollow that vanished, about the patriarch who sold children and then sold his soul to preserve his kingdom, about the night fire turned a hidden valley into an unmarked cemetery. They'll tell you that on quiet nights in early June, when the wind moves through the hemlocks just right, you can still hear children crying, or maybe it's just barred owls. But either way, you don't go into those woods after dark. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.